I'd like to take a moment now to introduce our 2015 Lipman Lecturer in Ethics, Dr. Sue Knight. But first, a special thanks goes to Ronald B. Lipman and the late Ronnie Lipman for sponsoring this annual lecture. The Lipman Lecture focuses on current ethical issues in the fields of education, business, medicine, science, and technology, as well as questions of justice. Dr. Knight will have much to share with us in the area of ethics and education, specifically as relating to curriculum development and possibilities for engaging in a philosophical ethics education with children from a young age. And we've had a number of great conversations about that over the past 2 days. Through her work in primary ethics in New South Wales, Australia, Dr. Knight has contributed as lead curriculum developer to an ethics education program that has been introduced in hundreds of schools to thousands of students. Dr. Knight holds a PhD in philosophy and a bachelor's in education from the University of Adelaide and has spent more than 20 years researching and teaching in the University of South Australia School of Education. Her research interests include the development of justificatory reasoning skills and the embedding of philosophy within school curricula across all year levels. And she has published extensively in these areas. Dr. Knight drafted the South Australian Years 11 and 12 philosophy curriculum and remains actively involved with the South Australian Association of Philosophy for Children. In 2010, she served as chief evaluator of the New South Wales Ethics Course Trial and is currently curriculum writer for primary ethics. And this is an organization that delivers K-6 ethics classes as an alternative to scripture classes in New South Wales public schools. Dr. Knight's address tonight is entitled After Lipman, a Developmental K-6 Ethics Curriculum. The talk will last around 45 minutes, and then we should have about a half hour for Q&A.
So I think it's 50 minutes. I try, unless I've got gavel.
50 minutes. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Knight.
There's that one? That one. Good. Fabulous. Thank you. Thanks very much, Michael. It's wonderful to be here, eating seafood and generally having a good time. But I have had a really good time talking to Michael and his colleagues about things that matter a lot to me. And it's a great privilege to be able to give this lecture. So thank you very much to everyone for coming. Well, as Michael has said, I've just finished writing an ethics curriculum that spans the school years, kindergarten to year 6. The curriculum is sequential, designed for systematic skill and knowledge development. And it's also spiral in form, to use Jerome Bruner's term. That is, in Bruner's words, the curriculum revisits basic ideas repeatedly, building upon them until the student has grasped their full complexity. This curriculum then sits in contrast to a loosely related set of topics or lessons. It's known as the Primary Ethics Curriculum after the not-for-profit organisation that commissioned it. The curriculum is grounded in the long tradition of Western philosophy, in moral theories formulated by some of the greatest minds that ever lived. Theories that have been and are still being questioned, tested and modified through a process of rational argument and counter-argument and then modification. It is grounded too in our rich and rapidly expanding knowledge of children's moral development, knowledge which comes from the field of developmental psychology. Finally, the curriculum works with a particular teaching approach. This approach involves 2 elements. One is Socratic questioning, the logically structured and open-ended style of teacher questioning that has been handed down to us from Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher. The second component comes from the Russian psychologist Vygotsky. It is a well-supported idea that learning is enhanced when children engage in dialogue with their peers. Dialogue here is not mere talking, but it is talking that is shaped by the rules of logic and by a shared interest in the issue at hand. Matthew Lipman, the founder of the Philosophy for Children movement, calls this two-pronged teaching approach, the community of inquiry method. And we follow him in adopting both his method and his terminology. But why write such a curriculum? To make this question manageable, we need to break it down. First, why write an ethics curriculum at all? More particularly, why write a curriculum aimed at elementary and primary school students? Especially a sequential curriculum of the kind I have just described. What good, if any, might we expect such a curriculum to do? These are the questions I'm going to talk to tonight. See if I can get this right. I'll begin in part one by addressing the questions why write an ethical curriculum at all, and particularly why write one for young children. Then in the longer second part of the talk, I'll go on to use examples from the primary ethics curriculum to illustrate the work's defining features and what I see as their value. So, to part one. Why write an ethics curriculum, and especially one aimed at elementary and primary school students? Let me begin with some questions. These questions all come from topics in the primary ethics curriculum. I'll start with the issue of lying. Is it morally wrong to lie? Is it always wrong? Or does it depend? Does it depend on whether the lie causes more harm than good? Or does it depend on the liar's intention? On whether she lies in an effort to avoid harm to another, for example? And are there circumstances in which it is not just permissible to lie, but where there is a moral obligation to do so? Where lying would save a life, for example. Is there a moral difference between withholding the truth, perhaps by deliberately diverting the conversation or telling only half the story? Is there a moral difference between these practices and deliberately telling an untruth? If so, what makes one morally worse than the other? We all engage in some, at least, of these practices. Is it important for us to think through the questions we've just raised? Is it important for us to think, and to think well, about such questions? Now to another issue. Most of us eat meat or fish, and many of us have pets, mainly dogs and cats in Australia. But I think you probably have funny things like gerbils and stuff like that, I don't know. I've heard of them anyway. We also, in Australia, have television advertisements featuring a happy family, pet dog included, gathered around the barbecue. We do lots of barbecues in Australia. Waiting for the pork chops to cook. Why is it that we are happy to eat pigs but not dogs? Is it the dogs are more intelligent than pigs? Is it the dogs are domesticated but that the pigs we eat are not? And does that, if that's true, as it is, does that fact have some moral import? Is it that pigs don't suffer? Or is it simply that it's part of Aussie culture, just as eating whales or dogs or refusing to eat meat at all is a part of other cultures? And if so, does it mean that we should all be tolerant of one another's food practices, whatever they are? Again, most of us eat meat. Is it important for us to think through questions such as those we have just raised? Is it important for us to think, not only to think, but to think well about such questions? One final topic. We are fortunate to live in a democratic society. In voting, we express a preference for one party, for one set of policies rather than another. And those policies affect the lives of others. The way we vote can make people's lives better, or it can make them worse. This puts voting in the ethical domain. And so we can ask of any act of voting whether it is morally justified. As voters, do we have a moral obligation to be well informed about the policies different candidates advance? And must we be knowledgeable enough to determine the likely outcome of such policies? Is it morally permissible to vote in our own short-term interests, even when we know that our interests clash with those of people who are worse off and perhaps with the good of society or the planet as a whole? Again, is it important for us to think through such questions before we vote? Is it important for us not just to think, but to think well? It seems clear that it is. Democracy depends upon it. And it is much the same with lying. Lying erodes trust, which is itself part of the glue that holds society together. And of course, at the individual level, lying can corrupt friendships as well as family relationships. On the other hand, of course, there might be circumstances when not lying results in harm to someone else. So we need to think carefully. When we turn to the question around meat eating, it seems clear that very few of us are willing to inflict unnecessary suffering on another. And so it becomes important, not just for the animals we eat, but for us to find out how much suffering, if any, our meat eating inflicts. And if there is significant suffering, whether we are able to thrive without eating meat. And it's important too that we come to grips with the question, if meat eating is part of our culture, does it follow that the practice is morally permissible or morally right? For this is an instance of a more general question. Is morality determined by culture? Or are there culture-independent standards by which we judge right and wrong? And it is clear that our answer to this question has far-reaching consequences. If we take it that morality is determined by culture, then we find ourselves unable to condemn practices such as racism or slavery. And moral education will amount to no more than teaching for whole-scale tolerance, including tolerance of intolerance. At the very least, these consequences need to be recognised. I take these examples to be representative of ethical issues, and on this basis I conclude that both individual well-being and the good of society as a whole depends upon individuals thinking well about ethical issues. For now, I won't go into details about what thinking well about ethical issues amounts to, except to say that, like thinking well in any sphere, it involves both skills and dispositions. The skills include general reasoning skills, the skills involved in putting forward good arguments that have true premises and logically supported conclusions. So to think well about ethical issues, we must bring knowledge to bear, as is demonstrated quite clearly in the voting and meat-eating examples we've been considering. And we must also engage in logical reasoning. But the skills are not enough. We must also be disposed to use them. We must cultivate certain habits of mind, including a readiness to seek the truth, to apply the rules of logic, and to think for ourselves rather than appealing to an authority, like the law, an elder, our peers, our culture, or our religion. To clarify, I'm talking here of blind appeal to authority, an appeal made in ignorance of the reasons on which the authority's view is based. Blind appeal to authority is never logically sufficient to justify a moral claim. And of course, history reveals its dangers all too clearly. Again, this is not all that's involved in thinking well about ethical decisions. And I'll come to the question of what else there is a little later. For now, I want to argue that supporting children, especially young children, to think well about ethical issues is properly a task for public schooling systems. Here's the argument. We know that the processes of ethical reasoning are, in large part, learned. This now seems beyond dispute, thanks to the work of developmental psychologists like Nucci, Smetana, Killen, and so on. What's more, we know that learning starts early. Even very young children, as young as 2.5, distinguish between moral rules on one hand and social conventions on the other. They judge breaking a social convention, say talking during quiet time in preschool, to be wrong only if there is a rule forbidding it. But this is not the case with their views of breaking a moral rule. Most children view hitting as wrong, and they judge it as wrong even when there is no rule forbidding it, and even if the hitting went unobserved. Moreover, they give reasons for their judgments, and those reasons have to do mostly with the consequences of the act, hurting someone, making someone feel sad, and also with general moral rules or principles. For example, it's wrong to make someone feel sad. We know too that as children progress through the educational system, their moral reasoning becomes more complex, and the correlation is stronger with educational level than with age. In making moral judgments, children come to consider and weigh additional factors, such as intention. Did she mean to strike him, or was it an accident? And motives. Maybe she was just getting even. As well as circumstances. Did she hit in order to protect herself? So the question is this. If in the classroom we were to focus on children's ethical capabilities, might we enhance the development of these capabilities and dispositions? After all, this has been shown to be the case with general reasoning skills. And could an early focus on the skills of moral reasoning make a difference? Both these suggestions seem plausible, and there are studies to support them. The studies report on different kinds of interventions and are evaluated using different instruments. But a common feature of these findings is that positive effects can be achieved, although this finding comes with a proviso. Positive effects depend on particular kinds of discussion-based teaching as well as on intensive teacher training. These points have recently been emphasised by a number of writers, including Lind and Nucci. We'll return to this proviso a bit later. Oh, I need another one of these. So far, I've argued that ethical reasoning skills are important and that education has the potential to enhance the development of even young children's ethical reasoning capacities. And on this basis, we might well expect standard school curricula to include programs for the development of these capabilities. But at least in Australia, this is not the case. Lip service has always been paid to moral education, and our current national curriculum has recently renewed the call. But, as in the past, no provision has been made for teacher training. The assumption seems to be that teachers already have an explicit grasp of the processes of ethical reasoning, and that teaching methodologies embedded in the standard curriculum, such as small group and whole class discussion, can be transferred effectively to the discussion of ethical issues. But it seems to me that none of this is the case. In surveys, teachers themselves have made it clear that they lack an understanding of the processes of ethical reasoning, that they lack a grasp of the techniques necessary to facilitate ethical discussion, and that they have little understanding of the criteria on which to judge the strength of a moral argument. And we know that in order to be effective, ethical classroom discussion must be scaffolded by means of teacher questioning that depends crucially on the very understandings our teachers appear to lack. Again, this point has recently been emphasised by Lind and Nucci, amongst others, and it's consistent with findings from the research into critical thinking instruction. To sum up this part of the argument, the Australian national curriculum, at least, is not well placed to to deliver effective moral education. Yet the processes of ethical reasoning are learned. Even very young children display a rudimentary proficiency in applying these processes. And we know a great deal about the development of this proficiency. Moreover, it seems that an explicit focus on ethical capabilities from the earlier school years is likely to enhance the development of these capabilities. So, there appear to be good reasons for writing an ethics curriculum for Australian elementary and primary schools. But of course, writing a curriculum is one thing. Persuading educational authorities to implement it is another, and far more difficult task. In the case of the primary ethics curriculum, we were fortunate. The New South Wales government agreed in advance to its development and implementation. This was a result of a peculiar set of circumstances, and I want to describe these circumstances briefly before moving on to the second section of the talk. So very briefly, in New South Wales, as in most other Australian states, except my state, public government schools still have what is called a special religious education in the years kindergarten to year 10. This is not a course in comparative religion. Rather, to quote from official sources, it is education in the beliefs and practices of an approved religious persuasion by authorised representatives of that persuasion. On the whole, these representatives are volunteer lay people. Of course, there are large numbers of students whose parents don't wish them to be involved in special religious education, and those children are exempted from religious education classes. Until recently, surveys show, the exempted students engaged in activities such as colouring in while keeping quiet, reading, playing board games and watching television. And this information comes from a parental survey. The New South Wales Federation of Parents and Citizens Associations, with the help of the not-for-profit Sydney-based St James Ethics Centre, repeatedly voiced concern at the obvious emptiness of these activities and lobbied for a secular ethics program to take their place. But at that time, the Education Act, bizarrely, I think, but anyway, specifically banned exempted students from participating in, and I quote, lessons in ethics, values, civics, or general religious education. And it took almost a decade before the New South Wales Parliament revoked the relevant section of the Act. At that point, the St James Ethics Centre established primary ethics as a subsidiary organisation to oversee the introduction of these ethics classes to New South Wales public schools. And so there was a need for an ethics course spanning the years kindergarten to year 10, and it was decided to tackle the elementary and primary grades first. If anyone's dying to write the next lot, let me know. Not only was there a need for an ethics curriculum, there was a need for people to teach it and a need for teacher training. And the new Education Act specified that the teachers had to be volunteers, despite the fact that a lot of classroom teachers were keen to teach it. They had to keep ethics in step with special religious education. I was asked to write the ethics curriculum for a group of volunteers. Okay, that concludes the first part of the talk. Now, part two. The curriculum. This must be another slide. Yes. The curriculum, its features and what I consider to be their value. I'll talk to 4 of these features. The curriculum's grounding in moral theories, its sequential spiral form, its grounding in what we know about children's moral development, and its pedagogy, Socratic questioning coupled with community of inquiry style dialogue. So, I want to begin by asking why it is that those in charge of the Australian schooling system have run scared of moral education. And a consideration of this question will lead us to the first of the crucial features of the primary ethics curriculum. So why is it that we don't find effective moral education in Australian schools? I'm sorry, I don't know enough about American schools to talk about them, but I guess you can make the comparison. I would argue that those in charge of public schooling systems are bedeviled by the fact of moral difference. People's moral values differ, and worse, conflict. Some people believe that abortion should be a matter of choice, while others take it to be tantamount to murder. Some believe strongly that capital punishment is just, others believe equally strongly that it is not. Some people think that divisions of labour within the family should be drawn along gender lines, while others disagree. Or that education is more important for boys than girls. That's an issue we have in South Australia right now, while others disagree. We could make a very long list of the moral differences that obtain within our multicultural societies. On what grounds can we say that some of these moral judgments are better than others? If we disagree over a factual matter, whether smoking is harmful, say, at least we can agree on the sort of evidence that will decide the matter. It is factual evidence about the effect of tobacco on lungs and blood vessels. But it is less clear what kind of evidence will decide the question whether or not capital punishment is morally wrong. Perhaps there is no objective, independent evidence to appeal to here. And if that's the case, how can we say that one of these moral positions is better than another? I believe this is the kind of thinking that has stalled the development of moral education. The result is that what passes for moral education is a shallow exercise in so-called open-mindedness and whole-scale tolerance. And, as was noted earlier, if this relativistic stance appears attractive at first glance, we need only look to issues such as slavery and racism to see that it doesn't take us very far. I think we can do better. We can begin by looking to the normative ethical theories of moral philosophy. For over 2,500 years in the West, philosophers have formulated theories which attempt to answer the question, how are we to work out what is morally right and what is morally wrong? Some of our greatest philosophers have spent a large part of their lives puzzling over these questions, or this question. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill, Kant and Aristotle. And their theories have been subjected to an ongoing process of critique and modification. This process of rational argument, counter-argument and modification provide our best hope of making progress towards an answer or answers to the question, what makes an action morally right or wrong? And this is the case even though, as is well recognised, no one of these theories is without its flaws. It seems to me then that to have any claim to authenticity, an ethics curriculum must be grounded in the normative ethical theories of moral philosophy. And this is true even of an ethics curriculum designed for very young children. So how can it be done? Here we need to look at the big picture. In writing the primary ethics curriculum, I've chosen to go with the traditional big picture view in which there are three broad classes of theories. We'll call them approaches to ethical decision making. One of these approaches is consequentialism. And the major, and I would say most plausible consequentialist theory is utilitarianism, the theory that John Stuart Mill, along with Jeremy Bentham, proposed. To the question, how do we work out what we should do? The utilitarian answers look to the consequences and act so as to minimise harm or suffering and maximise well-being or flourishing. In addition, the utilitarian holds that all human beings, and to varying extents other creatures, share common capacities for suffering and well-being, so that all human interests must be counted equally, and the interests of other sentient creatures must also be taken into account in proportion to their capacity to suffer and flourish. On this view, lying cannot always be wrong, because it is clear that there are circumstances in which lying brings about more harm than good. The axe murderer asking whether your flatmate is at home, for example. The second approach, the act-orientated approach, has it that it is not the consequences, or at least not the consequences alone, that determine whether an action is right or wrong. Some actions are right or wrong in themselves, intrinsically right or wrong. An example might be torture. On this act-orientated approach, torture might be held to be morally wrong no matter what, that is, irrespective of its consequences, irrespective of the good that might come from it. An act of torture that saved the lives of 1,000 people might still be wrong. On this view, we have moral duties to treat others, and this might include non-human animals, in particular ways, in ways that do not infringe the exercise of their reason, their freedom, their autonomy, or their rights. Their dignity, we might say, for short. Morality, then, is grounded in these capacities rather than in the capacity to suffer. On this view, to work out whether an action is morally right or wrong, we must examine the act itself to see whether or not it is the kind of act that infringes another's dignity, in the sense described before. If so, then the action will be wrong regardless of its consequences. The most famous act-oriented theory is that of Immanuel Kant. Here is one formulation of Kant's theory. We must always treat people as ends in themselves, never as means to our own ends. Kant also points to the importance of acting in accordance with a principle that could apply universally to all people. If it's okay for me to lie whenever it benefits me, it must be okay for everyone else to do the same. And if we think about it, where would that leave us? Kant points to the importance of intention as well. Suppose I visit a friend in hospital. For that act to be morally right, I must have performed it out of moral duty rather than, say, in order to make myself feel good. The third approach is known as virtue ethics. On this approach, the fundamental ethical question is not what should I do, but what kind of person should I be? According to virtue ethics, there are certain ideals, such as excellence or dedication to the common good, toward which we should all strive and which allow us to flourish as human beings. Virtues are character traits that enable us to pursue these ideals. Examples include kindness, generosity, courage and honesty. Virtue ethics is most often associated with Aristotle, who saw virtues as dispositions to seek, through reason, the middle ground between two extremes. In the case of courage, between the extremes of foolhardiness and cowardice. Aristotle argued that when people acquire good habits of character, they are better able to regulate their emotions and their reasoning, and so better able to make decisions that are morally right. On this approach, as in the previous one, an act is morally good only if it proceeds from a virtuous motive or intention. Helping someone in need, say out of kindness, is a morally good act. Helping it out of the vice of self-interest is not. In this way, virtue ethics too emphasises the role that intention plays in ethical decision-making. It might well be argued that there are important theories that this broad three-way division leaves out, and I'm sure that's true. But I think these three broad categories give us a manageable base, allowing us to embed each of these approaches within multiple curriculum topics, and to encourage children to think for themselves about the strengths and limitations of each of these theories. We do the same for theories of fairness, and I'll be talking about those a bit later. Of course, this doesn't mean that we teach the theories explicitly or expect children to be able to state them. What we aim to do is to encourage students to discover these ideas, to incorporate them into their own moral judgments and decision making, to try them out, in other words. It does mean identifying the skills children require to manage all this. To take one example, in order to understand the effects of their actions on others, children need to be able to put themselves in another's place. And so we have a number of topics focused on the development of this skill. We begin in Year 1 by building on children's rudimentary capacity to empathise. Here is a segment from the topic on empathy for grade Year 1s. I don't know, it's not a great photo, I must say, but anyway, there's a story behind it, but I won't bore you with it. This is Jack. So I'm reading from the curriculum now. This is Jack when he was about 4 years old. It's nearly Christmas, and he's helping to make the Christmas cake. This example comes from an exercise called "Does Looking Carefully Help Us Work Out How Other People Feel?" So here's Jack trying to make the Christmas cake. You have to use your hands because the mixture is very thick and heavy. Of course, Jack has washed his hands very carefully beforehand. Now shut your eyes and imagine you are Jack. You've got your hands in the cake mixture. The mixture is really gooey. It's squishing through your hands and sticking to your fingers. How does it make you feel? Let's pretend we have our hands in sticky, gooey cake mix. Can you make your face look like Jack's? Now look very carefully at Jack's face. It's a pity you can't see it better. How do you think he's feeling? All right, so that's one example. So, the curriculum is designed to encourage children to use elements of the philosopher's moral theories in their own decision making, to try them out. And as noted earlier, we want children's thinking to be based on good arguments whose premises are both true and logically strong enough to support their conclusions. I take it then that thinking well about ethical issues involves formulating good arguments that take into account at least some of the factors that the normative theories of moral philosophy identify as relevant to moral decision-making. As an aside here, given the absence of critical thinking programs in Australian schools, an ethics curriculum will need to include a reasoning skills strand as well. In the primary ethics curriculum, we've built a sequence of 9 reasoning skills topics, beginning at Year 1. At the early stages, we aim to build upon children's implicit and partial grasp of logical rules and to help them develop these intuitive understandings further. And later, we encourage children to discover some of these important logical rules or patterns of reasoning and to make explicit use of them in talking about ethical issues. Now back to the main argument. I've described one of the crucial features of the primary ethics curriculum. It's grounded in the normative theories of moral philosophy and, of course, in the processes of logically sound argument. And I've argued for the importance of such a grounding. Now I want to move to another significant aspect of the curriculum, its sequential spiral form. Ideas are introduced in simple form in the early years, as illustrated by the early empathy topic, and extended and developed in ever greater complexity over the following years. In the case of empathy, the concept is revisited many times until, in later years, students come face to face with topics such as child labour and homelessness. The topic of fairness provides another example. Fairness is a fundamental ethical concept, and as such, it is the focus of a number of topics in the primary ethics curriculum. It's also a concept in which young children, as I'm sure you know, have a keen interest. Fairness, as the term is used here, has to do with how we should divide things up. That is, with who deserves what. The big philosophical question is this: how are we to determine what different individuals deserve? In the West, the question goes back to the ancient Greeks. No surprise. Aristotle suggests the following principle: equals must be treated equally, and unequals may be treated unequally. And this principle forms the starting point for most subsequent philosophical discussion. Aristotle's principle tells us that no two people should be treated unequally given a larger or smaller serve of ice cream from the ice creamery, which is where I want to go tomorrow. Just been hearing about it, sorry. Given a larger or smaller serve of ice cream at a birthday party, say, until it has been shown that there is a difference between them relevant to this differential treatment. But what differences are relevant to differential treatment here? How hungry individual children are, how much they like ice cream, how well each has behaved at the party, or in this case, could it be that there are no relevant differences? What's needed here is a general principle to which we can appeal to work out what differences are relevant in this kind of situation. Here's a weightier example. What differences are relevant to awarding places in university faculties of education or medicine? Is it academic achievement, race, gender, level of socio-economic disadvantage? People disagree over such questions, and so do philosophers. A number of different general criteria or principles of distributive justice have been suggested. Examples include the idea that each individual should be given an equal share, the so-called strict equality rule, that goods be distributed according to individual effort, according to individual need, or according to individual merit. Our first fairness topic comes in Year 1. Research suggests that the 6 to 7-year-olds who are engaged with this topic will be, at some level or other, already thinking about what makes for fair sharing and articulating and acting on principles of fairness. Likely, the principle is likely to be a strict equality rule or an effort-based a principle. We know that from research. So we have a good basis from which to start. In this 3-lesson topic, the Year 1 topic, we begin with some questions inviting children to consider the strict equality rule. For example, we introduce a scenario in which Millie has brought a birthday cake to school. That's why you have that lovely image of the birthday cake up there. As is the custom in this class, the teacher carefully divides the cake into 15 equal pieces, one for each child and one for himself. But some of the children in the scenario don't think that's fair, and the real kids are asked to think about the fictional children's ideas. Here are a few of those ideas. Emma thinks she should get so I'm quoting from the curriculum again now. Emma thinks she should get a bigger piece than everyone else. It's only fair, she thinks. Everyone knows I'm Millie's best friend. Children are asked, what do you think? Fair or unfair? And crucially, what reason do you have for thinking that? Millie doesn't think Ryan should get a piece. Yesterday, when she fell over in the yard and hurt her knee, Ryan just laughed at her. He doesn't deserve any cake, Millie thinks. He's so mean. Is Millie right? Or do you think Ryan deserves a piece just like everybody else? Jen is new. She's only been at the school for a week, and her birthday was a month ago. It's not fair, Zara thinks. Jen gets to share in our birthday celebrations, but we don't get to share in hers. I don't think Jen should get any cake, and so on. And finally, for this topic, children are asked to think about the question, does being fair mean getting back what you put in? And this time we read the well-known story of the little red hen, who finds a grain of wheat in the farmyard and asks the mouse, the pig and the cat to help her plant it, to harvest it, to take it to the flour mill and then to make the bread. The cat helps a little in my version of the story, the mouse a bit more, but the pig does nothing. Then when the bread is ready, the little red hen asks, how should we share the bread? We have two other topics focused directly on fairness. The next comes in Year 4 and introduces the idea of distributing goods on the basis of needs. The topic begins by looking at situations in which being fair would seem to involve treating people equally. For example, where a teacher is handing out calculators to be used in class. It then moves on to look at situations in which fairness might seem to demand unequal treatment. For example, some children in the class find math easy and others find it hard. Should the teacher spend equal amounts of time helping each student or more time with those who are struggling? In subsequent lessons, we ask students to consider a number of real-world cases that involve affirmative action or distributive justice, positive discrimination. For example, in some schools in Australia, there are special lunchtime clubs for Indigenous Australian students. Children are asked to think about why this special treatment might have been meted out and whether they think it's fair. These questions pave the way for a more detailed discussion of the topic of equal opportunity in the Year 6 topic of fair society. This is a 4-lesson topic and begins, like most of our topics, with a short story. This story centres on a fictional television series in which a group of pioneers from a now uninhabitable Earth colonise a new planet, Liguria, and begin the task of creating a new and better world. The latest episode shows a group of people, the outsiders, who've been banned from the city and left to survive as best they can in the harsh conditions beyond the city walls. Water is scarce and the outsiders have no schools or hospitals. Two friends, Davey and Matt, are discussing the situation. Matt speculates about why the outsiders are there rather than inside the city, and Davey argues that whatever the reason, whatever the adults have done, it's not fair on the children. The outsider children have a horrible life, she says, I'm quoting from the curriculum again, and just because they've been born to outsider parents and not to parents in the city. And Matt suggests that that's just life, that some people are luckier than others. It's like that in our world too, he says. I don't reckon there's anything we can do about it. To help children think more deeply about the positions Matt and Davey take, we introduce a number of scenarios focused on the slippery notion of equality of opportunity. We look at cases of overt discrimination and then at inequalities which arise from the general workings of society, from things people have no control over. Gender, being born to rich or poor parents, for example. So here's a little example of... No, I don't think I'll read that. I'm running out of time. The following lesson deals with similar issues in relation to... Oh, no, I'll have to read it because it won't make sense. Okay, so here's an example of trying to come to grips with that idea of equal opportunity. Suppose the school principal decides that her school should have a choir. Again, this is an example in the curriculum. And that any student who wants to do so can audition for it. But in order to be chosen for the choir, students have to sing in tune. Is this fair? Well, everyone has an equal opportunity to try, and if you let those in who can't sing in tune, the choir will sound awful. But on the other hand, some students go to singing lessons on the weekends, so they have an advantage, they have a head start. To be fair, does the school need to offer pre-audition singing lessons for all those who want them, so that everyone is at the same starting point? Is this necessary in order to provide real equality of opportunity? And then it goes on, which I'll stop there. The following lesson deals with similar issues in relation to laws, beginning with cases of overt discrimination and working through to inequalities of opportunity that arise from the general workings of society. The question here is whether opportunities to vote, fight on the front line, for example, should be determined by things people have no control over. We then come back to the outsider children. Do they deserve the same opportunities as the city children? The final lesson raises the question of what, if anything, the Ligurian government should do to help the outsider children, and finally, whether a fair society is possible. So the curriculum is sequential and spiral. Why is this important? The sequential part seems pretty obvious. If we are after moral development, we need a program that builds skills and understandings in a sequential manner. And the spiral? I'm persuaded here by the arguments from John Dewey, the great American psychologist and educator, who said famously, this isn't actually his words, but I'm paraphrasing, you can't give someone an idea. Dewey was, in fact, the first, I believe, to use the spiral analogy, although it's usually given to Brunner. Grasping or understanding an idea, Dewey argues, requires a grasp of the reasons behind it. And we cannot achieve a grasp of those reasons without thinking for ourselves. But thinking is hard work, and, Dewey argues, we will only think for ourselves if there is a puzzle we want to solve, and if we have some basis on which to think. And so a curriculum must move back and forwards between what is known and what is problematic in a spiral. This point about having a basis on which to think is enormously important. One of the big breakthroughs in understanding developments in children's thinking was the recognition that young children can engage in so-called higher order thinking about a topic, but only if they have the appropriate background knowledge. So we must begin with what children know, and we must continue to build their knowledge base. Such knowledge, so I'm talking about an empirical knowledge base here. Such knowledge building plays an essential role in our curriculum. To write a spiral curriculum, there are some things we need up front. Clearly, we need a set of aims and objectives, but more than that, we need a framework which maps the sequence of around 80 topics from the first weeks of kindergarten to the last weeks of Year 6, the last years of primary school. Devising such a framework had to come first, or at least a draft of such a framework. On the primary ethics website, it says this is a living document or something, which lets me fiddle around with it. And I'm actually very grateful to Bruce Hogan. I ought to mention him, I think, as chairman of the Primary Ethics Board, for pushing me on this, and I was resisting and saying no, but he was right. It was a demanding task, and I have to also acknowledge Carol Collins, a colleague of mine, who helped me with that framework. It is on the Primary Ethics website if anyone wants to have a look at it. Okay, sorry, I'm nearly finished. Now for a third key characteristic. I can do this now. The curriculum's grounding in findings about children's moral development. The reason for this is pretty obvious. If we want to enhance the development of children's concepts of fairness, for example, we need to know what concepts of fairness they hold on average at different ages. It's this knowledge that allows us to be effective in scaffolding children's thinking about the topic. It lets us raise questions that encourage children to reflect critically on their own notions of fairness, to see the strengths and weaknesses of those notions, and to think about how the weaknesses might be overcome. Now, the final feature that I'm going to talk about, the curriculum's teaching methodology. It's pedagogy. If we want children to think for themselves, we must encourage them to do so. We must give children ideas to puzzle over, ideas which matter to them. And we must support them in their efforts to think hard and for themselves to try to resolve these puzzles. One way to support their thinking is to question in such a way that we draw children's attention to particular arguments or counter-arguments or facts or the need for facts that are relevant to the issues at hand and which they may not have thought of. This is what I mean by Socratic questioning. Here's a simple example from the classroom, and I apologise to those who were at the meeting the other day because I'm using the same example. In discussing the question whether it's okay to eat meat, a child says, "Of course it is. Humans have evolved to eat meat." This is actually, I'm describing something which happened in the classroom, and there is a chorus of support. Then the teacher asks, "What evidence do you have for that claim?" And together, children point to our teeth, the sort of stomachs we have, and so on. And now the teacher, "Suppose it's true that we've evolved as meat eaters. Does that make eating meat right?" And the reply, "Yeah, it does." Everyone says that it does. And again, the teacher says, "Give me a reason." And then someone says, "It's like the lions. They've evolved to eat meat, and we don't say that they're doing anything wrong." Another chorus of support. The teacher again, "Does anyone disagree?" No one does. So the teacher, once more, "Is there a difference between a lion eating an antelope and a person eating a steak?" She says, "You might need some time to think about this, so turn to the person next to you or get in a group for a couple of minutes and exchange ideas." Then comes the feedback from the groups. They note that steaks are usually cooked while antelopes not, and that we don't go out and hunt for our food, we go to the supermarket, etc. And then eventually one student says, "Lions have an instinct to hunt. It's all they can do. But we can make choices. We can eat vegetables and stuff." And then the teacher repeats the question, "Suppose it's true that we've evolved as meat eaters. Does that make meat eating right?" In the primary ethics curriculum, these teacher questions, we call them substantive questions after Splitter and Sharp, are written into the curriculum, together with the likely responses from students and further follow-up questions. Following Lipman, we call such logically structured sets of questions discussion plans. The teacher asks the substantive questions in order and in taking responses from students, asks further questions, what we call procedural questions. For example, does anyone agree with what Tim has said? How does what Tim has said fit with Anna's idea? Can you back up that idea with a reason? Can you give an example to illustrate your point? Can anyone help Anna state her idea more clearly? While at first the burden of questioning rests with the facilitator, in time, students themselves begin to question each other's views. And then we have what is known as a community of inquiry. A group, students and teacher, bound together by a shared interest in a particular ethical issue and a shared commitment to the procedures of rational thinking. Vygotsky's research has shown the effectiveness of collaborative inquiry, as has a more recent review of research into the effectiveness of dialogical teaching. In our curriculum, perhaps more than most, the volunteer teacher as facilitator is a co-inquirer. On the whole, she is not a philosopher. She does not have relevant philosophical arguments and principles at her fingertips. And that's why, in the primary ethics curriculum, we include detailed advice for teachers. Every topic begins with a background for teachers section in which we sketch the philosophical arguments and the developmental findings on which the topic is based. And it's why we have such detailed discussion plans. plans that, when implemented by the teacher, help both teacher and students discover these arguments and principles. And this approach goes some way towards reducing the training demands we noted as necessary for positive outcomes. Primary ethics volunteers do have training, 2 full days face-to-face, preceded by readings and exercises, and followed by ongoing discussion online, mostly, and further reading, but not the 150 hours that Lynn suggests is necessary. As an aside, it's worth noting that even trained teachers are not trained in moral reasoning, on the whole anyway, in Australia. And were they to implement a moral education program based in moral philosophy and developmental psychology, they too would require either very substantial training or the kind of support our curriculum provides. So you'll be pleased to know I'm up to the conclusion, which is only a short paragraph. The title of this talk begins with "After Lipman." The reference is to Matthew Lipman, the founder of the now worldwide Philosophy for Children movement. It was Lipman who developed the concept of community of inquiry on the basis of Dewey's work. In the 1980s, as part of his Philosophy for Children program, Lipman wrote a wonderful, if enormously complex, ethical program for middle school. The program was named Lisa, after the main character in the novel he wrote, the novel which was meant to serve as a provocation or springboard for ethical thinking and dialogue. Lipman's novel and its accompanying teacher manual were designed for systematic skill and knowledge development. Together, they formed a curriculum both sequential and spiral in Bruner's sense. And the manual includes numerous references to empirical studies on both cognitive and moral development. While the curriculum I have written differs in many ways from Lipman's, it has been influenced enormously by Lipman's work. And since Lipman's efforts, I think very few such curricula have been written. That is, we find very few ethics curricula which are sequential, grounded in the theories of moral philosophy and the findings of developmental psychology, and which employ a community of inquiry pedagogy. I wish we had more. Thanks.